So I'm going to be speaking about taxation. Of course, you're going to come across this argument, and I've came across this many times before.
So you'll hear this argument from some conservatives, but mainly anarcho-capitalists, also known as ANCAPs, and libertarians. The argument that taxation is theft, and oh boy, do I wish that ANCAPs and libertarians would try moving to Somalia for a bit.
They claim that this must be a capitalist country and the example of a free market because apparently descended into anarchy. And of course, you could add in the fact that it was constantly under attack. I think Ethiopia took over part of, Somalia. But as far as I'm concerned, when you're speaking about a free market, you would speak about something that has the rule of law and secure private property rights. But in his argument, he's trying to claim that this must be a capitalist economy. And of course, in a capitalist system, you would have free trade. Somalia is anything but a free market economy. Unless changes have been made in recent years, I don't know. I haven't looked at Somalia. When it descended into anarchy, it was anything but capitalist. And I'm not even an anarcho-capitalist. I'm someone who believes in minarchism. It was the same story with that of Hong Kong, the Kowloon walled city. You'll probably remember it was a disastrous mess and they tried to blame that on the free market. Now, I would consider Hong Kong's free market era was around about between 1948 to 1997. Now, I do acknowledge the fact that nothing's ever perfect in this world and things are down to a question of scale. When you speak about that time period, okay, we acknowledge the fact there was a central bank, we acknowledge the fact that there's manipulation of interest rates, and I wouldn't consider that free market, and I do acknowledge that fact. Typically a free market's something that's where the economy's left be, strongly to itself. And to a varying degree that was the case in Hong Kong. It had extremely low levels of government regulation and free trade. Business was free to set prices and leave it down to the laws of supply and demand. What was not mentioned was the fact that the Kowloon walled city was not owned by Hong Kong or of course China. Eventually in the 1990s they came to an agreement, Hong Kong and China, that they would demolish the Kowloon walled city because of the disastrous conditions. So it had nothing to do with Hong Kong and its free market. Otherwise, it would never have lasted that long. It would have just been, demolished a long time ago. And before 1997, the caged housing was rapidly in decline. You can't just say, oh well, look at Somalia, therefore there's a free market, there's your example of capitalism, and that just is so far from the truth, folk. It just isn't the case. Let's move on with his argument.
But I'm here to talk about why taxation is not theft. So first of all, without the state, you have no property rights. There is no such thing as property rights. The state creates these property rights, and this is something that libertarians often stumble on. You ask them, hey, how would there be property rights without the government? And they have no answer, and they often stutter very much because they can't explain this.
And the answer is there's a very big difference between collectivism and individualism when you're talking about rights. So what's the difference? When you're speaking about collectivism, you're speaking about positive rights. When you're speaking about individualism, you're speaking about negative rights. And the difference is the fact that when it comes to collective rights, when it comes to that of, collectivism, the rights are granted by the state. The danger with that is the very fact that since the rights are granted by the state, that means the state is giving them permission. It means the state can take those rights away from the people at any given time. And you saw this within the Soviet Union constitution. When it comes down to negative rights is based on individual rights, and those rights are natural to the people. No, the rights are not granted by the state. What he's basically speaking of, he's speaking of positive rights. He's not speaking of negative rights. Negative rights are rights that are natural to the people, like your natural right to freedom of speech. It means that your rights are protected. Doesn't mean that the state grants you those rights. It means that the rights are protected by the state if there's a government.
So the state provides the landscape of property rights and everything in it, which means that everything that you do, you are including the state.
Again, that is simply not true. It's like I explained, the state's role is there to serve and protect individuals' private property rights. It is not there to control the economy and have ownership and to grant such rights. It's there to protect the rights. There's a strong difference. And again, you could look at, for example, the American Constitution. It's a constitutional republic. It's not a democracy.
So when you sign a contract with your employer or your employee or whoever, everything is attached to the state because the state creates the whole landscape of property rights and everything that goes on in the state.
Again, folk, this just simply isn't true. Again, under individualism, rights are natural to the people. And he's speaking about basically how you sign some sort of contract, therefore it somehow gives the government the right to take those things, etc., etc. Let's just move on what he says next.
Also, you are receiving things in return. It is not theft if you are receiving things in return.
It's laughable to say the least, folk, because at the end of the day, it is theft. Although I am a supporter of minarchism and I do acknowledge the fact that therefore there would have to be some level of taxation in order for government to exist, even I can concede to the very fact that in order for that government to exist with taxation, there has to be some level of that theft. And unfortunately, I believe in that 10% tax rate because I do believe in a government, unless someone could come up with some sort of argument that could convince me otherwise. But that's besides the point. And I don't disrespect that of people who are anarchists. They have their own personal opinion. He thinks that just because you get some stuff in return, then that somehow makes it, moral. That somehow means that it isn't theft. It's a bit like someone who robs your house and then decides to give some of it back to you. Okay, that's still theft. You require consent. The word consent means permission. If you do not have permission, if you did not get consent from an individual, then you have no right to tax them. And that was the case in 1843. That was the case in 1913. In 1843, when the income tax was imposed in Great Britain on the British people did not ask for the income tax. When you impose an income tax on the people without their consent, you're basically taking from them without their permission through the income tax when you coercively force them into a collective group. And I'm not a big fan of the democratic system. The part of the problem with the democratic system is one part of the population gets to force its will upon another part of the population. And when a collective group gets to violently impose their will upon your individual rights, basically subordinates your individual rights, takes away your individual right to owning 100% of your own earnings, because after all that's what's happened. You've stripped the individual of their rights to do so, and then you're basically saying that because the majority voted, took away those individual rights, that somehow this makes it right because the majority said so, and if you don't like it you should just leave. And he gets onto that argument in a second. Through this issue where there was no consent to that income tax in 1843, when you take from someone without their consent, without their permission, that is theft. And it's theft because you're taking without permission. Doesn't matter if it's put in law. And if you think that, oh well, it's in law, that must mean it's right. Well, if that's the case, then all laws must be right. And therefore, you can never question laws. Because if you do not pay the income tax, you have the police threatening to put you in jail. Now, did any individual in 1843 consent to that income tax? Did anyone ask for it? Did any individual vote in favour of that? No, they never. And when it comes, because I've seen this argument before, people talking about collectively voting in today's economy, whether they vote for the Labour Party or the Conservative Party or Greens or SNP or whoever it may be, you may then make the argument and say, well, when they make such a decision, they are voting in favour of these services, therefore this is them arguing in favour of the income tax. No, you really haven't given the option to the individual. You have not put on the table the option for the individual to opt out of the income tax. And I've seen that argument before where they say, oh well, you agreed upon a contract sorry. When people went to sign up and they signed it, for a job application, when they applied for a job, in that job application form, you show me where on that job application form there was the option for the individual to opt out of the income tax. It wasn't even there. Just have a listen to what he says next.
You are funding the police department, the fire department, the military defense, social welfare, all kinds of different infrastructure, all kinds of different things. Public roads, you can't tell me you don't use public roads. You can't tell me you didn't call the police, the firefighters. The military defense is something that you can't even choose to do. That's something that defends the country.
It's this argument to say that, oh well, if it wasn't for government, wherever would we be? As history's proven, everywhere government intervention has been, it's led to an economic slowdown. You've seen it in Chile. You've seen it elsewhere. Sweden's economy, for example, isn't even performing half as good as what it once was. And what history has proven, clear as day, it's not even slightly evident, clear as day, the freer the economy has become, the better off the economy has performed. The mixed economy couldn't even come close to rivaling a free market.
Also, another thing is, you don't have to pay taxes. You can move to another country.
Like I said earlier on, folk, he's basically saying that, well, if you don't like the collective violence, people basically getting to collectively dictate and decide your life through the use of the government, if you don't like that, if you don't like the fact that your individual rights were stripped from you, well, you can kindly leave the country. His type trying to claim that because you live in the country, because you work in the country, and because you use the services, that must mean you have to support them. You see, people wrongly conflate the two. They conflate use and support almost as if they're the same thing. In fact, they're trying to say they're the same thing. Just because you use something, it does not mean to say that you support it. For example, you may use the NHS, but that doesn't mean to say that you support the NHS. For example, I have the right to oppose the NHS and support a free market in healthcare. When you take from someone without their consent, when there's no permission involved, then yes, it is theft. Doesn't matter how you try to paint it. You have these collective services. Just because people use them doesn't mean to say they support them.
Now, if you've been in the country and you've received all those goods that the government has given you, then yes, you have to pay taxes, or you're going to have to get a punishment, because otherwise people wouldn't pay taxes.
So in other words, what you're basically saying is, if there was the option for people to opt out of the income tax, people wouldn't pay taxation. That's a concession there. That's basically saying that people don't agree to it. Because in order for someone to agree to it, they would agree, they would pay the taxation, they wouldn't have a problem with it. What you've just did there, you've conceded that if there was an option there for people to opt out and not pay tax, then people would avoid it. So basically what you're saying is that in order for that to be there, you have to force the issue. You have to stick a gun to their head. And that's the reason why, forget the fact that socialism is a failure, which it is. I can tear them apart on that argument, but that's a whole other story. As he goes on to say,
you don't have to pay them. You don't want to pay them? Go ahead, move to another country. Just go ahead, move to another country. Maybe I suggest a libertarian utopia, Somalia. Go ahead, move there, check it out, see how it is, let me know how it goes for you. The idea that taxation is theft is utterly laughable and honestly quite sad.
When it comes to a general election and they lay out their manifesto and people are left in a scenario where they have to tactically vote Conservatives to keep the Labour Party out, they're not voting there for the sake of the income tax. You just admitted yourself the very fact that if you gave people the option to opt out of it, they wouldn't pay it. That's basically a concession to say, I agree that people don't support the income tax. And plus the fact, when people vote for the likes of the Conservatives, they're doing so as reactionary to that. And not everybody agrees with each other on things. Not everybody who votes for the Conservatives supports that of the likes of the NHS. It's not just a case that it's the failure of socialism. That's not the only argument against socialism. The main argument against socialism is that A defining ethic of socialism is coercion. Want proof of that? Just stop paying tax money, and let's see what happens then. You'll get the government-run, police department. You'll get them chapping at your door. If that's not state violence, what is? Of course it's violence. You're stripping the individual and their rights away from them. And you're trying to justify collective violence over the individual. You can't have socialism without coercion. It's a big part of socialism. It's immoral. The very essence of socialism is immoral. The only way that the NHS can exist is through theft and violence by the state. And it couldn't rival a free market in a month of Sundays. Anyway, folk, thank you for watching my video, and I shall talk to you later. Cheers.